So I, as Georgette said, my husband is a seminary student at Trinity Anglican Seminary in Ambridge. We attended Christ the King Anglican, where he spent many years growing up when we lived here in Virginia. We have two beautiful daughters who you'll probably hear in the back at some point tonight. And then my sister Jessie is also visiting with us, making these speaking engagements possible. So a round of applause for her sanity for the next couple of days. But tonight I have the honor to speak to you all about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, related to reproductive technologies, but specifically human embryos that are being created through in vitro fertilization. So we are all here tonight, I would imagine, because we care about unborn human lives, babies from that tiny moment of conception all the way up to birth, who are made in the image of God and have the inherent worth and dignity of being part of the human race. And yet, for many, many years, our focus has been primarily on those unborn babies. And it's time that we expand the conversation to include those unborn human embryos created through a whole other technological process. And that's what we'll focus on tonight. So without Francis Schaeffer, many of you have probably heard of him, the pro-life movement as we know it today would not exist. When the Supreme Court released its 1973 Roe v. Wade decision, many Protestant denominations and Christians were silent or mixed on the decision. At the time, the abortion debate had largely been confined to the Roman Catholic Church, and Protestants weren't all too sure what to think or if they wanted to really rally around the question of abortion. All of this changed with Francis Schaeffer. Through his books, his lectures, and his films, he wielded considerable influence over the moral imagination of American evangelicals. Although he never assumed a direct leadership role within the pro-life movement, his efforts galvanized Protestants into a potent political and social force that swiftly elevated the protection of unborn life into a national issue. Indeed, it's a big part of why we're here this weekend to March for Life. Decades later, this collective momentum resulted in a landmark decision to overturn both Roe and Casey and the Dobbs v. Jackson decision in June of 2022. Now, I believe that a very similar moment is unfolding with in vitro fertilization as it did with abortion. So if you remember, in 2024, the Alabama Supreme Court released another state court decision on IVF. This was in the middle of the election year, and it was dealing with human embryos that were negligently destroyed in a fertility clinic in Alabama against the parents' wishes and due to the clinic leaving a door open and having someone accidentally destroy a number of them. Now, aside from the facts of the case, which we can discuss later, what this meant is that for the first time in American history, the topic of in vitro fertilization was a mainstream national political issue. And all of a sudden, everyone had to wrestle with the question of what about human embryos? Are they the same as human embryos in the womb or unborn babies at 9, 10, 15, or 30 weeks? And that really launched, I think, an American awakening and even an evangelical awakening around the issue. And so in the same way that 1973 was a wake-up call for the evangelical church around abortion, I think 2024 is a wake-up call when it comes to the way that we have approached reproductive technologies in the United States. And indeed, more and more evangelicals are beginning to ask serious questions about infertility and assisted reproductive technologies, things like IVF and surrogacy and embryonic genetic screening. The opportunity before us, and part of what we're doing tonight, is to build a robust and compassionate framework that can inspire a new generation's pro-life movement to promote real and holistic healthcare that honors life from the moment of conception, even when that conception occurs in a petri dish. And so despite many, many pro-life victories, I think Protestants find themselves at a similar crossroads. Much like in the 1970s, there are many courageous leaders, many of you who are in this room, who have stood up for unborn life at the embryonic stage through IVF and surrogacy. But I think the broader evangelical church in America is still largely mixed on the issue. There's a lot of questions that they have, a lot that they don't know, and we're at a similar moment where we can take the mixed and uncertain view of the topics and really solidify it in God's word, through God's word, to affirm human life at every stage, no matter where the child is created. So take three stories, all three of which have actually happened in friends of mine who live in DC. So the first is that one of my friends was cleaning up after her mother's 50th birthday when she pulled her aside in a room and she said nervously, "I have something I need to tell you. You have two sisters you've never met." The questions started tumbling out. My friend asked, "Well, who are they? Where are they? Can I meet them? What are their names?" And her mother paused and said, "You can't meet them. They've never been born." And she told her in that moment that she had undergone IVF many years ago and had leftover human embryos that she didn't know what to do with. Another friend of mine found out on her 25th birthday that not only had she been conceived through IVF, but her mother was not actually her biological mother. And in a very similar scenario, they had leftover embryos they didn't know what to do with. And her mother now viewed those frozen human embryos as her children, but she was beyond her own childbearing years. So she asked my friend, who was 25 and unmarried at the time, if she would be willing to gestate the embryos and give her siblings a chance at life. And in the third story, one of my friend's parents carried a severe heritable genetic condition that they were terrified they would pass down to their children. So they, and they're not Christians and don't have a Christian background, underwent multiple rounds of IVF, creating dozens of human embryos and testing them extensively with forms of pre-implantation genetic testing to try to separate which human embryos may have that genetic condition and which ones wouldn't. So my friend and her sister are very, very grateful to be here and love their parents, but she lives with this sobering knowledge that she's here today, not her siblings who were destroyed because they could have had the genetic condition her parents didn't want to pass down. That weight, that reality is something that's becoming more and more common for men and women in my generation who are coming of age in a time where reproductive technologies are not only novel, but becoming increasingly normal in how we create and have children. The use of assisted reproductive technologies, including IVF surrogacy, embryonic genetic screening, and egg and sperm donation, have exploded in the United States since the first IVF birth in 1978. Unlike any other child ever born in human history prior to that point, the first IVF baby, Louise Brown, entered the world after doctors fertilized her mother's egg using her father's sperm in a petri dish. What began as a treatment for infertility, specifically due to cancer or blocked fallopian tubes, as the two primary causes were at the time, has snowballed into an entire industry whose primary goal is to help anyone, for any reason, have a baby. Sadly, this underregulated and unaccountable industry takes the lives of more human embryos every year than are taken by the abortion industry, attracting clients from across the world who don't merely want a baby, but want a certain kind of baby. And of course, they would be easy to point out there to the instances of designer babies, three-parent embryos, and screening technologies that promise parents the ability to choose the healthiest, smartest, and best-looking human embryo. But what about the everyday parents, those who were sitting often unbeknownst to us in church pews, who were struggling with infertility, or who were bearing the weight of really painful reproductive health conditions? Or to put it more specifically, what would you tell your spouse, your daughter, your cousin, or your friend from small group when they tell you that they're struggling with infertility and can't have the children they desire? These are the questions that our fellow congregants and people in our life are asking week in and week out, and yet few people are actually bringing these to their pastors or church leaders. One unpublished survey by Anglicans for Life found that when it comes to issues of bioethics, church members don't think that their pastors or elders or deacons are equipped to help them think biblically about their medical problems. So they oftentimes don't even bother to ask and just rely on their doctor, who likely doesn't share a pro-life view or a biblically founded approach to thinking about the dignity of human life. The result has been that churches or Christian leaders rarely talk directly about how Christians should think about infertility or reproductive technologies. And so some of the questions that I hear being asked in churches include things like, are human embryos persons, just like unborn babies? If an embryologist says that one of my human embryos isn't viable, is it okay to destroy the embryo? I have a heritable disease and I'm scared that my future children could inherit it. Is it wrong to use IVF to select one embryo over another? Or someone who's struggling with infertility, but aside from IVF, wants to know if the only option is just to pray and wait. Is there another solution aside from IVF? Are there root cause treatments that could actually treat infertility? Or take someone, I know a husband and wife, for example, who underwent IVF and now have multiple human embryos left over. The husband thinks their family is complete, but the wife really wants to give those human embryos a chance at life. What are they supposed to do? The need for biblically informed bioethics and beginning of life issues is the next iteration of our fight to protect unborn life, because these are the very same life or death questions we've talked about in the pro-life abortion debate that we now have to wrestle with when it comes to our use of assisted reproductive technologies. As David Glade, the pastor of our previous church, Christ the King Anglican, just a few miles from here, once noted, the contentious issue of our day is not who is Jesus or how can man be saved. These questions were asked and answered in previous generations. Today's theological question is anthropological. What does it mean to be human? To put simply, the church in our day needs to preach the good news of biblical anthropology, or what it means to be human today. I think it is past time for Protestant denominations and Christians to carefully examine the use of assisted reproductive technologies, particularly IVF and surrogacy and embryo screening. Biblical ambiguity or a lack of thoughtful teaching, particularly on issues related to the creation, gestation, and birth of human life, do a disservice to the church and lead people into confusion or sin when they don't know how to interact with these difficult issues. And I want to be very clear. I Am and Anglicans for Life is in no way saying that those who have struggled with infertility, who have undergone IVF, or even born because of IVF, are in any way less than, less loved by God, less worthy of life. But it's quite the opposite. It is that because human life is made in the image of God, is so good, is part of his beautiful vision for filling the earth, that we want to be as careful and as thoughtful in how we protect and promote the goodness of life, period, regardless of the situation. So what I want to do in our remaining time together is make the case for a package deal of marriage, sex, and procreation, starting with the Bible, God's holy word that's fully equipped, authoritative, and prepared to answer this question. And it's from the Bible that we will get a vision and a worldview, not only of the package deal of marriage, sex, and procreation, but what God has to say about his heart for infertility and for the reproductive technologies that we use. And I'll conclude with an overview of some of those technologies, which we can also jump into Q&A a little further. So, in Genesis 1, we see the what purpose of man and woman. God blesses Adam and Eve to be fruitful and take dominion of the earth. This fruitfulness applies to childbearing and all other work. God blesses Adam and Eve with fruitfulness as a gift. The Bible here describes children as blessings from God, yet the creational reality of fruitfulness is not a command that gives parents the right to create children by any means, especially if it violates the core principles of Scripture, but it is a blessing to be fruitful and multiply, to receive children as a gift. And the Bible also shows us the how of procreation. In Genesis 2:24, it says, "Therefore a man shall leave his father and his mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh." The Bible places procreation in and through this unbroken bond of marriage. And so throughout the Old Testament, you see many passages where the biblical vision of marriage, sex, and procreation are presented as an unmediated package deal. And so it's through this singular and exclusive bond of marriage between one man and one woman, where you have procreation, where you have sex, and then you have procreation as the gift of children that comes from it. And we understand marriage as Anglicans, and I think broadly as Christians, for its fourfold purpose for procreation, protection from sin, mutual enjoyment, and the upholding of Christ's kingdom through the church, family, and society. And from that marriage is the gift of children, Lord willing. But if you look in Genesis 3, we very quickly come up against the world not working as God intended it. And this is the why of infertility, or the explanation of where infertility first appears. And so it says, I will surely multiply your pain in childbearing. In pain you shall bring forth children. Genesis 3:16. The baggage that accompanies that verse could fill up an entire other talk of its own. But suffice it to say that one of the really interesting things I found in studying this passage is that when it talks about the pain of childbirth, it's the same root word that's used to talk about the pain of toil, referring to Adam's work. And this pain doesn't just mean literally the physical pain and discomfort of giving birth to a child, but it refers to the entire scope of the desire to have or not have a child, the anxiety around conception, the vulnerability of the pregnancy process and of giving birth, and also the sort of fear and anxiety that can surround motherhood. It's this comprehensive difficulty that now accompanies something that was once meant to be a natural gift and blessing of desiring and bringing children into the world. And interestingly, the word for pain used in regard to Eve also carries with it the connotation of idolatry, or this temptation to want to seize control of and idolize childbearing in a way that God never intended it. Interestingly, I think most of you are probably familiar that idolatry is often defined as very broadly as anything you want more than God. But to be more specific, idolatry occurs when we replace God's authority with our own authority and make decisions based on what seems good and wise in our own eyes, as Adam and Eve did when they ate the forbidden fruit. The temptation to idolize children in this way is one of the most powerful forces at work in the world today, but it is not unique to our generation. Since the fall of humanity, this idealization has led people to control or play God rather than steward or be faithful to what God has given us, especially when it comes to our fertility. We try to play God by controlling how, when, or even if we have children, rather than being open to life and marriage and faithfully stewarding our fertility and the children God gives us. One really powerful example of this is found in the Old Testament. So throughout Israel's history, God's people were constantly turning from worship of the one true God to worship of idols. Interestingly, the false god that Israel most often turned to instead of God was Asherah, the goddess of fertility. In their attempts to control their own fertility, play God, the Israelites would bring sacrifices or perform sexual acts in front of this false goddess and hope that they would receive fruitful crops or children because of it. And if they weren't worshiping the one true God, they were idolizing this goddess of fertility, trying to get what they wanted on their own terms. And I think when it comes to seeing God's heart for infertility, notably, the big three patriarchs and their wives throughout Scripture all struggled with infertility: Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Rachel. And they all three had slightly different ways of addressing it. So Abraham and Sarah suffered greatly because they failed to trust God's promises and his timing. And in doing so, they turned to another woman and brought a third person into that exclusive bond of man-woman marriage. It was more like concubinage back then, but it's also a old-fashioned form of what we would call surrogacy today, using a third woman's reproductive potential to have a child for you. Then you have Isaac and Rebekah, who prayed fervently, and God granted their request and gave them a child. Praise God. And then you have Jacob and Rachel, who use mandrakes, which is a fertility stimulant, to help them have children, maybe a form of like root cause care to help stimulate their fertility. But they also used Rachel's maidservant, because Rachel didn't just want children, she wanted as many children as her sister Leah. And yet at the end of the day, Leah still had more children, because ultimately it is God who chooses to open and to close the womb, and it's he that's in control. And so ultimately, as many of you know, probably very personally, infertility is not fair. And even our best attempts to have children do not always work out. As with the Israelites, Abraham and Sarah, Rachel and Jacob, and many of the other options before Christians to address infertility, though they were maybe culturally normal, worshiping a false idol, they were false options. It was normal in ancient Near East to worship multiple gods in hope of reaping maximum benefits, and yet it resulted in sin and death for Israel. It was normal to use one's maidservant to bear more children, yet it violated God's package deal of marriage, sex, and procreation as a unified whole. And in the end, such actions brought suffering, envy, or strife to the lives of those who did so. Of course, the desire to have children comes from God. Fertility was his idea from the very beginning, not ours. Such children, however, are a gift for God and not just a right for adults, as Katie Faust of Them Before Us has said so eloquently. And when we simply make having children our goal, we run the risk of sinning or sending ourselves down the wrong path in our attempt to achieve a child by any means necessary. So at the end of the day, it seems that when we're looking at the Bible, there's a clear example that anytime we add degrees of separation between this continuum of marriage, sex, and procreation, we either sin or introduce opportunities for sin. And so, for example, when you're looking at the case of IVF is adding a break in that continuum of marriage, sex, and procreation, such that it's no longer between just the man and the woman, but it now includes the fertility doctor, the temptation to use a surrogate, a third woman, donor egg or sperm from another individual. It's not necessarily a sin in and of itself, and yet it sends us down this road where we view children as this act of the will that we can procure rather than this gift that God gives. And this is where the temptation comes. And so the last example that I'll use is in Malachi 2:15. It really ties together this unified vision where it says, "Did he not make them one with a portion of the Spirit in their union?" And what was the one God's seeking? Godly offspring. So guard yourselves in the Spirit and let none of you be faithless to the wife of your youth. Here, Malachi describes marriage and sex within the bonds of marriage and godly offspring together as the singular but multifaceted vision of what God intends. You see this from Genesis 1, Genesis 2, in Mark 10, and in Luke 20 as well, which each discuss marriage, sex, and procreation together in their consideration of what a natural and godly marriage consists of. I'll double check our time. Great. So with that biblical context in mind, I wanted to dive into a few of the particular technologies that we're really dealing with today. And this is where the bread and butter of my daily job comes in, where I'm working with policy, working with bioethicists, and working to educate people on how we actually think about these technologies. And so over 2024, it was a rather busy year when it came to the topic of IVF. We had speeches, we had panels, we were working with anyone who was really interested in understanding it better. But something very quickly hit me, that even if we were to achieve all of the best regulations and protections around IVF for the human embryos and the parents involved, it would actually still fail to address the bigger issue at play, which was ultimately, how do you help couples who are struggling with infertility have the children they desire? Because at the end of the day, the question wasn't more or less IVF, but how do we help treat those couples and help them receive the medical care that they need? And so it helped us pivot the conversation away from just a debate on IVF, but a broader question on what is infertility and what is the value of the human embryo. So put it simply, you frequently will hear people say that infertility is a disease and then go along to describe the means by which you're diagnosed with that disease. But the reality is actually a little different. Infertility is not a disease, but it's not a standalone disease, but it's a symptom of underlying reproductive health conditions. So you don't get infertility like you would get a tumor in cancer or your appendix would rupture, but it occurs when something is not working right in the man and or woman's body. And so for women, this includes conditions like endometriosis, PCOS, adenomyosis, blocked fallopian tubes, hormonal imbalances, or lifestyle factors. And a lot of younger women in the room might be going, yeah, I think I have friends who have dealt with this. This is actually surprisingly common for women across the United States, and yet is not always treated with the timeliness and respect that's needed. For men, you have conditions like low sperm count, low sperm motility, and other lifestyle factors that make it harder to conceive, whether that's their weight, substance abuse, or how much they do or don't work out. And so what this means is that taken together, infertility can be due to the woman, due to the man, or a joint issue about a third of the time equally. And when you're dealing with infertility, fun fact for you all in case you were all curious, you're usually looking at 4 or more underlying reproductive health conditions. So infertility isn't just here's a single cause with a single person and our single solution, but it's actually a multifaceted issue occurring within the man and woman's body that requires very detailed diagnostic care to actually root out what's going on, and then how do we best treat those conditions to enable men and women to have the children they would otherwise naturally conceive. And so, but unfortunately, many times when a couple is struggling with infertility, doctors will quickly put them down the road of assisted reproductive technologies, pointing them towards things like IVF sooner before they've actually done the deep diagnostic and root cause care that they need. And so a few of the things that I wanted to flag for you in the process of IVF, and I want to be very careful and clear here to say that I'm going to talk about routine IVF here, so the kind of IVF that the fertility industry would typically start with. This doesn't mean that everyone who's undergone IVF has gone about it this way, and there are many Christians who've been very intentional to do so in a very particular way. And I'm not talking about the particular instances here, but in routine IVF in the fertility industry, doctors want to increase the success rates, and so they try to create as many human embryos as possible. Studies that we have show that on average, doctors will create about 10 embryos, as many as they can at a given time. And now I am a huge fan of big families, but I don't think that most of us here are really trying to have 10 kids, even if you're struggling with infertility and deeply desire a big family. And yet they're creating as many human embryos, as many human beings as they can to try to increase the chances of success. Because the reality is that taken together, IVF only has about a 25 to 35% success rate per cycle, and yet can cost upwards of $30,000. For women over 40, who are the ones who are oftentimes relying on IVF, they have less than a 10% chance. But unfortunately, these aren't the things that are being told when a couple is struggling with infertility. It's just a positive message of if you keep trying and if you keep making more human embryos, maybe it will work for you. And of course, the reality is once those human embryos are created, you have 4 options before you. You can implant the embryos, you can freeze them indefinitely, you could destroy them, or you could put them up for adoption. But once they're there, they're there. And given that there's over 1 million frozen embryos in the United States today, it tells me there are a lot of parents who find themselves in a terrible position where they have human embryos and they have no idea what to do with them. But to some degree, they recognize that those human embryos are their children and they don't just want to destroy them, but they're in this lose-lose situation that they just weren't prepared for on the front end. And to put some of the numbers in perspective, we oftentimes talk about IVF success rates related to the baby that's actually born. But what about the success rates for all the human embryos? So 2021 is the most recent year that we have CDC data on IVF in the United States. That year, there were over 413,000 IVF cycles in the United States. Now, this is rough back in the napkin estimates because they don't give us these numbers from the federal government. But if you say on average, there are about 10 human embryos created in each of those 413,000 cycles of IVF, you're looking at the creation of 4.1 million human embryos in 2021 alone. How many children were born from IVF in 2021? Just over 97,000. So we celebrate each of those children born because we love babies and we love human life. But what about the other human embryos that never made it that far? It means that for embryos involved in IVF, they have about a 2 to 10% success rate at best. So it's not that we don't like IVF babies, it's the opposite. We want to meet all the other babies who were created and who were never given that chance in life, either because they didn't implant or they were destroyed or they're still frozen indefinitely here in the United States. Now, one of the very common features, if you will, in IVF is the use of something called pre-implantation genetic testing. Now, there are a few different forms, but at its most basic, pre-implantation genetic testing allows researchers to analyze a human embryo just a mere days or weeks after it was created and ascertain things about it. So, for example, it's really easy, pretty much really easy right off the bat, to tell whether that human embryo is a boy or a girl. There is no gender confusion in a fertility clinic. They'll tell you right away how many boys you have and how many girls you have. It can also allow you to start looking at things like certain genetic conditions. What's the likelihood that this embryo will have Tay-Sachs disease or Down syndrome or Huntington's disease? But there's a whole new form of polygenic screening. I don't know if any of you have heard of Orchid or Nucleus Genomics or these new companies that are promising not only to screen your embryos for basic things like sex or eye color or basic health outcomes, but they can actually give you a predictive score for over 2,000 conditions. What's the likelihood that your human embryo will suffer from insulin resistance? What's the likelihood it will have male pattern baldness later in life? What's the likelihood your human embryo could be tall, have a certain IQ, name anything that you want. It's literally 2,000 different conditions. They try to cover them all. And they give you this risk score, giving you this idea that you somehow have control over choosing a certain kind of human. And of course, at the end of the day, this really comes down to a consumer eugenics where it's now commercialized on the market for a mere additional $2,500 that you can choose the best kind of embryo. And the really wicked thing about it, to be very frank with you, is that it plays on the deepest desires and fears of parents. Every single parent wants to have a healthy child who will live their best possible life. And so what these companies are selling them is this desire, this ability to think that they can somehow control the kind of child that they have and avoid the natural pain and vulnerability of bringing life into the world. Because of course the reality is no matter how hard you try and protect your child, sometimes hard things happen. Maybe they aren't quite as tall as you wanted, or maybe they're way smarter than you ever thought they would be. There's this aspect of receiving the gift that these companies are selling you a certainty that goes far beyond what is proper for humans to seek. And then there's the issue of surrogacy. Now, we talked a little bit about surrogacy when it comes to Abraham and Sarah, because their version is just a traditional old-fashioned form of what we would call surrogacy today. But of course, the examples of surrogacy are getting weirder and weirder. You have cases across the board where Chinese nationals are coming to the United States to rent the womb of an American woman to have babies born in the United States who get birthright citizenship, but go back to China, where they can either come back to America as citizens, or in the case of some Chinese nationals, have 100 children to build a dynasty because there aren't enough women who want to have babies in China. Or you have the cases of men who are registered sex offenders who have backgrounds as pedophiles who are able to contract with a woman, create a baby, and have a child, even in cases where they should otherwise not be anywhere near children and would have certainly been rejected by any adoption agency doing a halfway decent background check and home visit. But even beyond that, in the normal cases of surrogacy, what surrogacy does is it ultimately reduces a woman down to her biological function, her womb, her ability to give life. And it adds that third person into that marriage bed, or adds a woman who they're otherwise not married to if they're single. But even beyond that, one of the things that is so heartbreaking is that surrogacy strips a child of the only mother they've ever known. Totally apart from biology, surrogacy, gestation makes you a mother in a very real sense, which is why things like embryo adoption, adopting embryos that have been abandoned and giving them a chance at life, is a very valid form of motherhood. Because once that baby's born, the only scents and smells and sounds that that baby knows is the woman who's gestated and carried her for 9 months, not the biological parents who paid for the child to come into the world. And so when you see babies naturally climbing up their mother's stomach and rooting for their first connection with their mother, what's so interesting is that the amniotic fluid inside a woman's womb has the exact same scent and smell as the early breast milk a woman creates. So when a child is climbing towards the breast, it's not just because they're hungry little, babies who just have to eat all the time, though they are that, but it's because what they smell is the only familiar thing in the world. And yet in surrogacy, they're taken immediately and given to people who may be their genetic parents who love them, but have no other connection to the child outside of that. And so on that closing note, the thing that I want to leave you with is that for Christians today, the answer isn't just wait and pray, though prayer should absolutely be a part of everything you do. And the answer isn't to throw up your hands and say, well, if IVF and if surrogacy and if embryonic genetic screening don't honor God, then there's just nothing I can do. But instead, there have been incredible medical developments in the world of restorative reproductive medicine or root cause care that actually have trained medical professionals and specialties across the United States that truly diagnose and treat those root causes of infertility. And based on the studies we have, the success rates are comparable to, if not slightly higher than what you have in IVF. And instead of creating human embryos who are placed in a suboptimal position, you're actually restoring the health of men and women and resulting in healthier births for multiple generations to come. And so I'm so very grateful for all of your time and for your attention, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with Georgette and Elaine. Thank you.